Hey, dear listeners, this is the seventh episode of the Deliberate Talks podcast, and this is Dakshin Adyantaya, who in today's episode features an unconventional story. And by an unconventional story, I mean by a career that beyond the orderly aids us to think about the world that breathes beneath us. So gear up and let's literally dive deep into some cool facts about the ocean today. While we all know more than 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, according to the Ocean Service, we have explored only less than 5% of the Earth's ocean. Wow. According to the world's Register of Marine Species, there are now 240,470 accepted species. However, this is believed to be only a very small size of the species that have been explored. Did you know the Pacific Ocean is the world's largest ocean that contains around 25,000 islands? Bizarre, right? And if you are wondering why I'm talking about the oceans today, well, in today's episode of Unconventional Career Stories, we have a guest who is a marine scientist. So now let's go and explore. But before that,
this is the Deliberate Talks weekly podcast, powered by the Pixelated Egg Digital Ventures. Tune in every week to learn something new about digital marketing and entrepreneurship. And now, over to the voice of your host, Dakshin Adyantaya. Enjoy the show.
So in today's episode, we have an independent marine biologist from Chennai. She holds a master's degree in tropical biodiversity from the EU-funded Erasmus Mundus program. Upon her return to India, she ran a Pondicherry-based marine conservation collective called the Temple Reef Foundation for a year and a half. Today, she leads the Artificial Reefs and Sustainable Fisheries program in a collaboration with Quest Academy. Apart from being an avid scuba diver and a kayaker, she also works with environmental education initiatives in the southern part of India. Here's introducing Suneha Jagannathan. Firstly, thank you, Suneha, for being a part of the Deliberate Talks podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are a marine biologist, and that's very fascinating to hear. And also my intention of having you on the show was more to understand what work you do. And like me, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the world who don't understand really the seriousness of the work that you do. So this might be a great platform to actually educate people. So let's start with knowing a little bit about your journey and what drove you to become a marine biologist.
The work that I do is a combination of research as well as a lot of education and a bit of outreach work. So essentially, actively participating in marine conservation and learning more about the marine world, as well as communicating that with people who don't know anything about the marine world. So actually talks like this and podcasts like this, I think are great to be able to, communicate the work that the research community in India does to the larger public who might not really have much of a clue. So my story is, well, I'm from Chennai, so I pretty much grew up 2 minutes away from the beach. Even today, my parents live around 5 minutes from the beach. So I was always connected to the ocean in that sense. I love nature and animals, so I always knew I wanted to do something, on that front. It was a wide range of career options that I considered as a child. It went from veterinarian to, at one point, deep sea diver to scientist to anything and everything related to animals was going through my mind. But then I started seriously considering it when I took up my bachelor's in zoology. After that, my interest got more and more serious in wildlife conservation. And I did a bunch of internships and volunteering positions with different organizations in the country. And one place that really sort of opened my mind up to the field was I used to volunteer in the weekends with the Madras Crocodile Bank. So for people who are not from Chennai, the Madras Crocodile Bank is a reptile zoo, essentially, and conservation center that's located around 30 to 40 kilometers from the city center. And through that experience, I just got to learn so much more about what research and conservation and wildlife and even the ocean really is. After my bachelor's, I interned with the Indian Institute of Science. And what they do is they work on a wide range of topics. And what I was working under was to see how do corals recover from a bleaching incident. So this was a really interesting idea for me, and it sort of opened my eyes into coral reefs and marine biology in general. After this, I did my master's with the Erasmus Mundus program. So this is basically an EU-funded program. It's funded by the European Union, where the deal is that each semester you go to a different country and you learn in a different university within Europe. And since my master's was on tropical biology, we also got to spend one semester in a tropical country. I was in Belgium, and then I was in Malaysia, I was in Italy, and then I again finished my thesis in Brussels. It was an amazing 2 years where I just got to travel and really understand conservation from a more global perspective rather than something that's very regional or location specific. And after that, I came back to India because I really wanted to contribute to conservation in India, and I felt there was a huge scope in India as well. And I was running Temple Reef Foundation, it's the marine conservation collective by Temple Adventures, which is a scuba diving company in Pondicherry. So I was there for about a year and a half, following which I decided to start working independently. And I collaborated with Quest Academy, which is an adventure sports and travel company based out of Rameshwaram. So we were working on constructing and understanding how artificial reefs can be used to sort of restore the marine habitats that have been lost in that region. So yeah, that's my journey in brief.
Wow, very fascinating. Yeah. How old were you when you actually found your inclination towards becoming a marine biologist?
Man, like when I was a kid, like it was sort of gradual, no? Like it was animals and then it became nature and wildlife. So it's something that I always wanted to do my entire life. I pictured myself either in the beach or in a forest, So I ended up picking the oceans and the beach. But yeah, it was something that I always wanted to do. Yeah, I'm not surprised that I ended up doing what I'm doing today.
And this must be a really nerdy conversation with your friends, right? Or were they used to you speaking about birds, fishes, oceans, and the animals?
No, I was a nut. So growing up, I was the nut. Like I was the animal freak, and like my friends would get so irritated with me talking about dogs and cats. So no, I was definitely the weirdo in my group of friends from school. But of course, there was always a community you find of people who are actually interested in similar stuff. I found my tribe eventually.
But now this must be like a really intellectual conversation with your friends, right? And they must be wondering, wow, she travels across the world and she does diving and always talks about the ocean. This must be like a really cool conversation now, right?
I think also Instagram plays a big role because when you put photos of yourself diving, people automatically think you have this like glamorous, cool job and career. But honestly, in reality, I spend much more time on my computer or on a desk than I ever do in the ocean. And I'm not complaining. I don't mind at all. But yeah, marine biology is, I would say, 20% of field work of being out in the ocean and diving, and 80% of reading papers, writing reports, analyzing your data, and the boring work.
Wow. And that's the side which no one sees, right?
Exactly. No one wants to show it. No one wants to see it, right? Because it's not exciting for young people to really look at it or showcase it.
Right. Now, tell me something interesting about your work. Some very interesting stories or things that you do at work, something that you really do, which is very different.
So, in terms of things that I've done, what I usually work on is artificial reefs. So to sort of give the listeners an idea as to what they are and why we need them, with a combination of both overfishing as well as climate change, as well as marine pollution, whatever marine habitats that we have, coral reefs are one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the entire world. So they are extremely important, not just for the intrinsic value of them being beautiful places to dive in and just them being there, but they also contribute to global economies in a huge way, right? Because two of the largest ways in which corals contribute to people's livelihood and people's well-being is they are a main source of food. Everyone who likes to eat seafood, thank your coral reefs, thank the oceans, would not exist without them. And secondly, tourism, right? It employs thousands and thousands of people in different parts of the world. It gives travelers a different view of any place they go to. Like imagine Thailand, but without the beautiful beaches, without places to snorkel and with dirty water. Would anyone even want to go there? So that itself is the intrinsic value of a beautiful coral reef. And in addition to that, there's a lot of real economic value as well. The reason we need artificial reefs is because most of our existing marine ecosystems have been damaged So an artificial reef, put in very simple terms, it's like building houses for fish underwater. It's like how we build apartments on land for us. We're going around building apartments for fish underwater. But in a more serious and technical way, what it does is that it provides an area for, number one, for fish to actually go and breathe. And number two, it provides a substrate, which is basically a platform for any other animal to sort of grow. Because if you look at a coral reef itself, it's not just fish, right? The coral itself is a breathing animal. And it's a colony of thousands and thousands of polyps, and it takes millions of years for a coral to become an entire reef. And what we are trying to do is sort of give it that step ahead, because a coral cannot really grow on sand. And even when we're talking about a coral reef, it's not just the corals that live amongst that reef. There are a lot of other invertebrates. So invertebrates are any animals that don't have a backbone. So when you're looking at that beautiful picture, the colorful picture of coral reefs, you see finger coral, you see table coral. It's not only the coral and the algae that live there. You're also seeing sponges, you're also seeing clams, crabs, apart from just corals and fish. So what an artificial reef does is that it gives that stability for other animals to sort of start growing on them. Because if it's just what we call coral rubble, that is corals that have been completely pulverized by trawlers or just because they're bleached and they've sort of fallen apart because they're too weak. An area like that is very hard for corals to regrow because there's not a lot of hard, solid structure for a new coral to grow upon. For a tree to grow, you need soil, right? Similarly, for a coral to grow, you do need what we call as a substrate, or just essentially a platform that helps them to grow, a solid platform that helps them to grow, that sort of doesn't move around in the current, in the water. So that is where an artificial reef comes into the picture. So artificial reefs are grown in different parts of the world. In some places, it's just put down for recreational value because it attracts a lot of fish. And then you get a lot of tourism that comes into the area through diving, because they want to go underwater and see that, whether it's a shipwreck or whether it's sort of an artificial wreck. Secondly, it also sort of rejuvenates that ecosystem because it provides that platform for the coral reef to regrow on its own natural way. And this is definitely a lot slower than what a lot of other people do, which is coral transplantation, where they actually pick up fragments of coral and attach them to a substrate, which helps them grow a lot faster. Professionally and personally, I don't do that. There's no one reason. There's so many different ways of doing this. This is another way I'm trying to do it, is that we just go down and put concrete blocks underwater, and eventually corals will, in a span of a year or so, slowly start taking over and become a more lively and alive.
So is this a tried and tested kind of a method?
Yes, this has been done. It's not a new concept. It's been done since, like in India, it's been done since the 80s and the 90s. The government itself has been putting down a lot of artificial reefs because it helps with fishing as well. Like fish are not, they're mobile organisms, right? They can go and actively select a habitat. They will go to an artificial reef, assess that place, and decide that this is where I want to stay. So usually what happens is you'll see some really small fish that come towards an artificial reef, and they sort of start hanging out there because it's a lot of shelter for them to hide from predators. Right. And slowly they might start reproducing because they're like, hey, this is a very safe place for me to hide. Nobody is coming and hunting me down here. And then eventually the number of the smaller fish, as they start increasing, it will sort of attract the predators as well, because they're like, there's a lot of food for me here, I might as well stay here. Right. So it ends up attracting a lot of fish that you would not naturally find in the local ecosystems over there. And that also helps with the fishing industry. So the government of India themselves have been deploying artificial reefs for a while now. So it's not like I'm coming in and doing anything particularly new. It's just that we're trying to do it on a scale where it can actually be implemented in different parts of the country.
Interesting. And what about divers? So what are some of the most common mistakes we as divers do when it comes to destroying marine life? And what are some tips for them?
So I am not a professional diver, so I might not be the best one to give out tips, but just in general, if you notice, you'll see in a lot of places, right, divers, most often they're the new divers, the ones who recently did their certification course. You know, it takes some time to get there, and that's totally fine and acceptable. They usually tend to sort of hold on to a coral or inadvertently sometimes step on a coral. And that is really bad because, of course, you're causing physical damage to that reef. So this is particularly bad in some parts of the country where there's so much of diving happening. Like in the Andamans, dive tourism is so huge that you have so many more people over there, even first-time divers who won't even know and realize that, hey, I'm actually doing something that's bad for the ecosystem. because most people don't have that awareness of this is a live animal, right? They just think these are rocks. That is one of the main ways in which divers actually impact coral reefs. And this has been documented in scientific literature for about 15, 20 years now in different parts of the world. So that is something that divers can avoid, is not to touch coral, to work on their buoyancy so they're able to stay still in the water and look at that beautiful fish or whatever it is without having to hold on to any piece of that habitat. And secondly, you do sometimes see divers who are, how do you say it? It's not even inadvertent, it's pretty intentional, where they disrupt a marine animal, just to take a picture with it, or they try and poke it at an octopus just to get a reaction out of it. There is no debating whether that's right or wrong. That's obviously not okay. That is taught to every diver when they start out diving as well, is to don't disturb marine life. If you want to appreciate any animal, just look at it. If you want to take a picture, but don't disrupt its natural behavior. And if you feel that the animal is feeling threatened by your presence, move away. Don't go closer and scare it. Because every time any fish or an octopus is stressed out, it releases a lot of stress hormones within their own body. And that is obviously not good. A human who is stressed out is not as functional and normal as a happy human, right? It's, of course, the same thing with marine animals as well, is when they get very stressed out by the presence of humans, it will affect their other functions as well. So try to avoid stressing. If you notice or have some intuition that this animal is a little stressed out by my presence, move away. It's not really worth it.
Right. I think this really needs to be a part of the education for everyone who is keen on being a diver or wants to go and explore diving. And speaking of education, this goes back to also the fact that you train a lot of youngsters and children. How different is it to actually educate children from the rural areas and children from the urban schools? Do you see a huge difference in terms of how their learning process is?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, because I would categorize it as rural and urban, which is an important divide that you pointed out. Urban kids tend to learn more in terms of the technical aspects of it. Maybe they'll know more about corals or climate change, because we have to also understand that youngsters today are not just learning from school, right? They're also learning from TV, they're also learning from social media and their computers online. So urban crowds are generally more aware of those of those sort of global issues like climate change and overfishing and coral bleaching and whatnot, that rural students don't tend to have. But rural students have a much more stronger understanding of the smaller issues of the marine environment, especially because a lot of the rural students I've interacted with are from fishing communities, right? So naturally, they grew up by the beach, they're excellent swimmers, they are comfortable around any natural environment, and they have that much closer connection to nature than urban students do. So there's positives and negatives to both. And secondly, even amongst urban communities, there are the students who are from who go to very expensive private schools, and then there are the students who go to government schools, right? So even in Chennai or Pondicherry or wherever, there is that divide as well. So, and I mean, students who are a little younger, I would say like 12, what I see they look for is they really want to see role models. They only see parents doing your regular type of jobs. They don't have people amongst their friends or their peers or their parents' friends who are doing something different. So when they even meet someone who's doing something a little different from what they see in their regular life, it gives them a lot of excitement, and that also gives them a lot of hope as to, hey, this is something I can also do, because there are Indian people who are doing this sort of work. There are Indian women who are doing this sort of work. So maybe it's a career I can also consider.
Absolutely true. And emphasizing on mentorship and guidance. So Neha, what's the scope for a marine biologist in our country? And what are the career advices that you would give to aspiring ones? Also, what is the industry like, the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead for them?
So I think there is quite a bit of scope, especially in the coming generation, because the world is sort of waking up to environment and climate change in a very big way today, and a lot bigger than it was when we were younger and when we were in school. So for young kids who want to get into the field of marine biology, I think there's certainly a lot of scope. I would say a lot of scope in India specifically, because we're still a new, young, developing country where the scope to implement your own ideas. Whereas in the West, conservation is a very old concept for them, in the sense of like these large organizations. They've been doing it for a very long time. So implementation of new ideas is in my personal opinion, a lot easier in India and developing countries in general. And there will, I see, be a lot more funding internationally in conservation in the coming years. So I do think there is that opportunity of whether there's money to be able to implement ideas in India. I would say I'm positive about that. In terms of challenges, there are definitely are challenges because there's no one roadmap. Like if you want to study medicine, there's places you can go to get trained. If you're doing an BCom and MBA degree, again, you have placements. Marine biology is a lot trickier because there's no concept of a placement or people who will come looking for candidates to hire. You have to take a lot of initiative. You have to shed whatever shyness that you have and start writing to people. Yeah, that's how I started. I would just Google conservationists in India, find out the big organizations that are working, and start writing to all these big scientists and biologists and conservationists, and someone or the other will respond. And you can even go and say, can you please be my mentor? I want to get into this field. Can you please help me? I guarantee you there'll be someone who responds. You can't expect a response from everybody because that's just not going to happen. There are a lot of student conferences as well. There's one that happens in Bangalore every year called the Student Conference of Conservation Science. And it happens in IISc, which is the Indian Institute of Science. And it is like the mecca of wildlife biologists and conservationists in the country. The topmost, the best of the best come and attend it. They're giving talks, they're giving speeches. So go and attend those kind of conferences. And that's where you'll get to meet more and more people, right? And look for local conservation groups in your own city. You don't need to travel to Thailand. You don't need to travel to the Andamans to be able to really learn about marine biology. If you're living in Bombay or Chennai or any coastal city like Cochin, you do have that opportunity of having someone or the other locally who is working on this field. Whatever opportunities you get, grab it with two hands and work towards it, and that will sort of envelop and develop bigger as you grow older.
And if nothing works, then get in touch with Suneha. So while I was researching about you, I came across this article which says a 17-year-old got in touch with you for some guidance.
Yeah, his dad first contacted me when I was in Pondi. And he said, my son and daughter are both so interested in marine conservation. And yeah, it definitely, you can always write me in whatever capacity. I'll be happy to help.
Awesome, yeah. So regardless of mentorship or, going ahead and starting initiatives by yourself, tell me, where does the funding come from? Are there organizations helping your initiatives, or is there any government funding that supports these kind of initiatives?
So in India, there are a few grants that you can get that fund independent researchers and independent biologists. They're not very large grants. They might be like 1 or 2 lakhs, which is in the large scope of things in conservation. It doesn't amount to too much money, but if you're starting out, it's a huge opportunity. So there's the Ravi Shankaran Fellowship Program, and that is a great resource in terms of they are happy to fund new, interesting projects. They don't look for people who have 10 years of experience. They want young researchers to come with their ideas and implement their projects in their own way. And that's a great sort of opportunity for people to write to. I would personally recommend, if you are interested in research or conservation, find yourself a supervisor or a mentor who will help you guide through the process, because there is a lot that goes into it, right? It doesn't start with, I want to do this and I'm going to go ahead and do it, unless you're sitting on a fat bank account of your own money and you can go ahead and spend it. But if you actually want to go about getting it funded, you have to start off with whatever idea you have. It can be something as simple as a beach cleanup. Whatever idea you have, write it down and write a proposal out of it. And then you can start looking for funding opportunities. Mostly best to look in India, because if you're getting in foreign funding, there's a lot of regulation. There are organizations like WWF as well, as far as I know, who are giving out small grants. There is Wildlife Conservation Society as well that gives out a small grant. That's a really great way for you to start getting that experience of how to go about implementing that. Send it to a couple of people who have more experience in the field, who might be able to look through your proposal and tell you where you're lacking or where you're doing well. I think that getting feedback on your proposal before you finally submit it is extremely important, because you will think it's a great idea. Like, I always think my ideas are perfect. Who doesn't? But it's very, a funder might not see it that way. And it doesn't even have to be only conservationists. You can even ask your parents, your teachers, and then you can go about implementing that project. So some people tend to do it independently. Some people tend to do it as part of a larger organization. And that's really a personal choice.
Right. Just touching upon the outreach part of it, while your school initiatives are a fantastic idea, what about those who aren't educated enough about this topic? How do you intend to reach out to them? And what are the current mediums of communication that you're using to reach out to them?
So for people who are this general English-speaking audience, there is always social media. Not just me, there are so many environmentalists out there who are posting regularly about just nature as well as governance. For people who speak good English, I would definitely say Instagram, Facebook, etc. is a great way to get the word out. The larger part of our country is people who might not understand these big things that we put up on social media. And for them, I would say smaller programs that are targeted towards their community. So, for example, the work that I was doing in Rameshwaram along with Quest Academy, we were spending time with the local village children every Sunday, where they had to clean the beach for about an hour. Each kid has to collect one bag of plastic, and in return, they get free lessons in a particular water sport, right? Either stand-up paddling or kayaking or whatever. And that was a really great way to get them interested and engaged in it, because they got to have that fun in the water. But it was not just fun and games, because it evolved into sort of an environmental education program as a whole. They learned about waste management, they learned about marine biodiversity, they learned about what are the different types of waste we even see on this beach and where does it actually end up. They learned different aspects of the water sport itself. So that was a great way to sort of engage the kids, because you can't keep children inside a classroom and expect them to learn, right? They do that every day in school and it's really boring. So more open air, field-based, nature-based modules is what I do for who are not like on your Facebook and Instagram and what.
Wonderful. So now let's get into a quick round of a rapid fire.
Mm-hmm.
And you know the rules of rapid fire questions, right? You need to be really prompt at this. So are you ready for this?
Yeah, I hope so.
Great. So your favorite diving spots in the world would be?
Not too many, but I love the Andamans. I've not dived in many places.
Okay. If not a marine biologist, what would you have become?
I love to cook, so probably I'd have a food truck.
Okay. On most occasions, people want to be a part of a good campaign, but they don't know how to go about with it or initiate it. How can one, if interested, be a part of your campaigns or associate in what capacity?
Again, it can either be an environmental campaign or it can be a conservation project. But I would say use your skills to your benefit. You don't have to become a biologist to help in marine biology or marine conservation. If you're a designer, you can help biologists design some excellent posters and communicating their work. You can help in writing things about the environment. If you're great with social media, you can help some conservation organizations with spreading the word about what it is that they do. So understand what your skills are first and go in with contributing that skill set to the scientific and conservation community.
Nice. So what's the most adored marine creature and where are they found?
Oh, this is hard. Probably olive ridley sea turtles, because they also nest in Chennai, which is very, very close to my heart. And they nest across the East Coast in India.
Right.
So yeah, they are my favorite.
I recently happened to see a Tamil picture called Selu Karupati. I think that's how it's pronounced. And it means palm candies. It's actually 4 stories in one film. One of the stories actually highlighted the turtle walk, which is quite popular in Chennai.
Okay, yeah, there are turtle walks happening in Chennai every year. You should definitely go for it. That's how I started as well. I used to volunteer with Student Sea Turtle Conservation Network. They're a great organization, fully volunteer driven, and they conduct turtle walks every year from December, end of December, Jan, all the way till like April. So anyone in Chennai should definitely look them up and join them.
Yes. In fact, the plot of this particular story is where an elderly couple meet over a turtle walk and fall in love.
Oh, really? That's actually very romantic.
Yes. Right. Continuing with this. So when you're not working, where do people find you or how do you spend your time?
When I'm not working, people can't find me anywhere. I'm at home. I'm not the most social person out there. So I'm in my house or my friend's house or at the beach with my dog.
Nice. Your message for tourists who don't understand the importance of marine conservation.
Learn. There's so much of information out there nowadays. Find tourism operators who respect the marine environment. As a tourist, some red flags would be if your scuba diving instructor is dragging his students along the coral reefs or he himself is standing along a coral reef. If your scuba diving company that you are choosing to go with wherever in the world, if they're putting up photos of customers or their own staff touching marine wildlife or touching coral, that's a huge red flag. Don't go with them. Find tourism operators who are careful about their carbon footprint and who are involving the local community in whatever way.
Okay. And finally, what's next for you?
I don't know yet. I will let you know as soon as I know.
Brilliant stuff, Sneha.
Friend us on your socials and let's connect.
And now I'm just going to quickly move on to our last question, which is basically a question from a user. The question is that the beach cleanups are a great initiative, and a lot of people come forward to be a part of such drives. But how does one constantly evaluate the effectiveness of these drives and maintain it consistently once the drive is completed?
It's actually a really, really great question because I believe that beach cleanups they do one thing in a very major way is they spread awareness. But beach cleanups on their own might not be a solution to dirty beaches and waste management issues that we have because you're essentially taking all that garbage from the beach and you're putting it in your municipality dustbins. Well, how does the municipality deal with that waste? A lot of it ends up back in the ocean, right? So I think beach cleanups are a great way to sort of engage with the people who are joining you. What I used to do is in the beginning, in Pondi's, in the beginning where we beach cleanup is I would have briefing with the people who are volunteering with me. And we would sort of tell them the different kinds of waste that you would find and how to segregate that and not collect all the garbage they find into one bag. Avenue that can evolve from that is to sort of manage the waste that you're collecting yourself through your beach cleanup campaigns and be able to sort of at least part of it get it recycled, instead of just dumping everything with the municipality. And secondly, use that opportunity to talk to your volunteers about their effects, because everything that ends up on the beach is almost entirely consumer waste, which means it's people like you and me who are throwing it. Ice cream sticks, it's chappals, it's plastic bags from shopping, wrappers from chocolates and whatnot. So these are all things that we are actively actually contributing to. Use that to sort of drive home the message of this is all because of the people who are here. And that will sort of hopefully enlist a sort of behavioral change in the people who come there. You go and clean a beach is when you really realize how much of an impact you have on the ecosystems that you live in. So I think that is the way to go in terms of making it more than just a one-day beach cleanup.
Makes sense. Great stuff. That's pretty much it. Thank you for being a part of the Deliberate Talks podcast, Sneha. And this has been a refreshing conversation for us and definitely something new to learn. So thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time and I got asked some very different questions.
Awesome. That's the intent. And thank you. Well, that's it for today's episode. I would love to get your feedback. You can write to me at deliberatetalks@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on the social media platforms of the Deliberate Talks and the Pixelated Egg Digital Ventures. Join in next week for another conversation with another guest. Till then, inspire and be inspired.